It's the beginning of a new year, time when a middle-aged man's thoughts turn to making that piece of junk in the garage work better, or maybe in my case, how we can make something that isn't such a piece of junk. I'm starting a new series on kind of do-it-yourself chassis designs, looking at things from kind of a pragmatic standpoint of how you can make something in your garage. I'm going to be dealing with vintage stuff. I tend to do a lot of aluminum monocoque kind of construction, but we'll also talk a lot about steel multi-tube frames, space frame kind of stuff. I did a video on my GT40 chassis design, and I said there that I don't want to publish the exact design because I don't want to step on the toes of the many replica car makers out there, because I don't want to hurt their business. But I got some inquiries about my Lotus 38 replica, and I thought, hey, I've got no problem sharing those plans. The only problem was I didn't have intact plans for it anymore. And I also want to change a number of things. I want to create new plans because that was the first thing I ever made, and there's stuff I wouldn't make it again that way. So I'm doing this series on chassis designs, and we're going to look at a few things. I am going to share my 38 plans, and I wanted that to be this first video, but of the 4 videos I'm planning, that's the only one I don't have all of the designs ready for yet. I'm still working on them. I have actually recently designed a new chassis, and I say designed, I'm still going through drafts. I'm still iterating on it. But we're going to do a video talking about that, and we'll go through why I'm choosing to do what I'm doing, and what things are maybe a little dumb, and what things I think I'm doing right. And that might progress into the actual building of the car. And we'll do a similar thing looking at my Lotus 38 replica. Today, though, I want to do kind of a primer course on race car chassis design, and really looking at the kind of vintage 60s and 70s stuff that I tend to focus on. But I want to try to demystify a few things. Some of you, if you're thinking about building your own car and you think, oh, I could never do a chassis, and you've looked at multi-tube things, and there's just these crazy tubes going everywhere, and you're like, I have no idea how you would plan out something like this. It looks like gibberish to me. I want to try to demystify that for you. If you're an engineer and you're looking for a course on the best ways, the absolute best ways to make a race car, this isn't for you. This is a much more beginning level, and focusing on the kind of materials that you can readily source in your area. No autoclaves will be required for the stuff we're talking about. But let's start at the beginning. Like, what's the point of a chassis or a frame? Really what we're doing is we're connecting the wheels all together. We need to support a drivetrain that's also connected to those wheels, and we need a place for a driver to sit with controls, a steering wheel, pedals, stick shift or paddles. There'll be some other things like cooling, fuel tanks. We'll need fuel tanks. But really, we're just trying to hold all those things together and connect them to the wheels. And we want that structure to be as light and as stiff as possible. And obviously there's some compromise there between how light we can make it and how stiff we can make it. Now, why? Okay, if we're talking racing, the heavier the car is, that's all the more weight that you have to accelerate, decelerate, and pull through a turn. So the lighter a car is, the faster it will be with the same amount of power. If you have the same engine in 2 cars, the lighter car will generally be faster. Then stiffness is incredibly important, and for a few reasons. On the basic structure of it, like things where the suspension connects to the chassis, you need those points to be stiff, because if you're using a suspension to control the wheel and the way it gets camber gain in a roll, if where, say these are your upper and lower control arm, and this is the chassis, if the points it's connecting to are flexing, then suddenly your wheel is doing things that you didn't plan for, and it might not be doing it in the most predictable way. I mean, it's doing it at times you weren't expecting. You're suddenly losing traction because your wheel's doing something it's not supposed to do. This can, on a bigger scale, if the whole chassis isn't stiff enough. Torsional, I mean the twisting stiffness of a chassis is really important. And there's the story of the Lotus 30 had a backbone style chassis, which means there's just metal going down the middle of it. If you've never done it, Google Lotus Europa chassis or Lotus Elan chassis. You'd be amazed at how little there is holding that car together. But the Lotus 30 was a similar thing, but except it was ridiculously thin gauge sheet metal making up the backbone frame, and in the back was a fair-sized Ford V8. So there was enough torque and a lack of rigidity that when you got on the gas, the torque from the engine would actually twist the chassis, which meant you're coming out of a corner, your wheels are planted, taking the load of the car going around the corner, you hit the gas, and suddenly the chassis twists, which changes the contact patches on all the wheels, and then twists back as that surge of torque balances out. That creates unpredictable handling. That's the kind of thing that if you hear about people talking about a car inspiring confidence, that's the kind of thing that takes confidence away. So that's at a really root level. But then on a broader level, you want a stiff platform, especially in torsion, but also bending. And I mean, you want it to be a stiff platform because assuming you have a suspension, assuming it's not a go-kart, you want to do your chassis tuning with the suspension. And if your chassis is flexing, then you can't do tuning the way you want to be able to. And let me give you an example. If say you had, because you can have a good handling car with a flexible chassis, it may just all balance out that way. And there have been cars in history like that where Cobras had chassis flex. And that was tuned, because the chassis flexed, the suspension was tuned to work with it, and they weren't the best handling cars ever, but they got them to work well in that way. The problem is, so say you've got a car and it's oversteering. The tail wants to slide out everywhere. It's also got plenty of body roll. You really don't want to go softer on the springs. So rather than soften the rear springs, you want to stiffen the front springs to get more of the cornering load on the front tires, take it off the rear tires. It'll balance better, and you'll get a more neutral characteristic. So you put those stiffer springs on. Well, if the chassis is flexing, you might not get any difference in the way the car handles. You've put the stiffer springs on, so you know, okay, theoretically, I should have changed the tune of the chassis. But because the chassis is flexing, it doesn't care that you put stiffer springs on. The chassis is just flexing more. So you've still got the same load on the rear versus the front. And that means you can't tune the way you want to. You could say, okay, well, then I'll just have to do softer springs on the rear, and maybe you can make it work that way. But now you've got more body roll than you wanted. Having a stiff chassis makes tuning straightforward and predictable. And the driving of the car predictable. Again, it's not going to flex in some weird, there'll be some situation where suddenly the chassis flexes, and that just changes the characteristics of where the tires meet the road. Everything you do on a car meets the road through the wheels and tires. So the tires are the most important thing. So everything we do is how do we control those contact patches? And that's where the importance of chassis design comes in. Types of chassis. Now, this is something you can read. This is Mike Costin, David Phipps, Racing and Sports Car Chassis Design. You get a lot of insight from what was going on at Lotus. And this is Forbes aired the race car chassis, which both of these books, I'm guessing the guy who wrote this had read this, because both of these books go through the evolution of the chassis in the exact same way. This is obviously more current, so you might just want to pick this up. I enjoyed reading this because you're getting it from the horse's mouth from people who were at Lotus in the 60s, in the mid-60s. I'm going to go through this as kind of an evolution in time. All of these different types of chassis are still present today in the automotive world, but there's kind of a reason the way things are the way they are, and it's because of the progress that was made from each one. So early on, cars were made with ladder type chassis, and if you're unfamiliar with that, we call them ladder chassis because they look like a ladder lying flat. It's usually two metal beams. Sometimes they're rectangular tubes each one. A lot of times they're just C-sections because that's cheaper and easier to manufacture. And there's a few things connecting them. Well, maybe the main advantage of this type of chassis, besides being really simple, and it doesn't have a lot of material, is you can put any type of body you want on this. You could put an open top car, a coupe, a truck, a van, an RV. It doesn't matter. The body is something completely separate from the chassis. Downside is they have the rigidity of a wet noodle. If you don't believe me, ride as a passenger in a pickup truck, in a Chevy 1500 or a Ford F-150, especially the older the better. And as you're going down a bumpy road, look at where the bed meets the cab, because they're two separate structures. They're not together. And if you look at they'll usually be like an inch gap or 3/4 inch gap. You can see them doing this as you go down the road. And it's an alarming amount. People tend to think of a car as being this really sturdy, solid metal object. And you can just see it flexing like crazy. So from a race car standpoint, a ladder chassis is not great. So the next thing people did was created what we usually call multi-tube frames. And a lot of times it was the same idea of the two main things going down the bottom, but then they'd put two tubes higher up and had tubes. So it's not just a ladder on the bottom with things going across, but there's lower tubes and upper tubes, and they're being connected that way. And sometimes you hear people talk about the space frame, and we'll get to that. The space frame is a specific type of multi-tube. But the point here is just to get more rigidity, both in bending and torsion, by having the frame not just be on the bottom, but up higher too. And if you're talking rigidity, there's something that happens with metal where if you have, say you have a square tube, a steel square tube, and it's 1/8 of an inch thick walling, and it's 2 inches by 2 inches. This is a square tube. That has a certain amount of stiffness. If you took the same amount of metal, but had a thinner wall that was spread out more, so say, I haven't done the math, but say it was, instead of 1/8 inch thick, it was 1/16 inch thick, but instead of 2 inches, it was 4 inches. It's the same amount of metal, it weighs the same amount, but that bigger one is stiffer. And there's a point where it doesn't work anymore because the metal is so thin that it'll buckle too easily. But in general, having that metal further apart makes it stiffer. It's giving you more leverage against the loads. So having these tubes further apart made a stronger structure. Now you've probably heard the term space frame. Generally speaking, when we say space frame, we're not really using the term correctly, because in an automotive application, it's almost impossible to do a proper space frame. The theory behind a space frame is so you have all these tubes. The idea is that if the ends of those tubes, where they connect to each other, rather than being welded or brazed, which is what you would do making a race car, just imagine though, if the ends were rod ends, were rose joints, so they were technically a movable joint. If you made a proper space frame, no matter which way you put a load on that structure, it wouldn't twist, because it's always got a tube resisting that force in tension. Like, what? Wait, what? Tension is the strongest way to use metal. At least the metals we're going to use. I don't know if there's an exception to this rule, but we're steel, titanium, magnesium, aluminum. It's strongest in tension. I know this isn't metal, this is paper, but it's going to work for the analogy. But obviously different materials work in different ways. If you were engineering with sand, you would not work in tension, you would work in compression, because the weight of sand, if you're building a sand castle, the weight of the sand locks it together. You can't hang things from the sand. There's nothing to hold it together if you're using tension. But if we're talking metal, so if I tried to put this on top, we all knew that was going to happen. And if I tried to put it here, we all knew that was going to happen. But if I did this, it holds it just fine. So you might say, oh, what if I took that same amount of metal and I put it into a square tube or a round tube or something, then you could hold something on top. You could, but it would buckle when it was going to fail. When you got too much weight on it, it would buckle and fail that way. Whereas it's going to buckle at a much lower weight than what it can hold in tension. That's buckling. So in building a car out of metal, you want to use the material in tension. And a basic thing to understand is if your chassis, this is the top of the chassis, this is the bottom of the chassis, with all the weight of the engine and the driver and everything on, that load is putting the top part in compression because it's being pushed in, and the bottom part is being pulled out, so the bottom's in tension. So there's an old rule of thumb that you can use thinner gauge metal on the bottom than the top. A lot of times, with the safety factor we're going to use, it doesn't really matter because we're going to use slightly thicker metal than we need anyways. But that is a principle you can use. So the thing with the space frame is, the reason it's nearly impossible to do in a car is the engine and the driver are two really important things of the car that can't have a tube going through them. And that means you end up with these big spaces in the car that compromise your structure. And that's why you end up with this kind of crazy arrangement of tubes. You might, if you've ever looked at a tube frame and you're just like, I can't, there's too many things going every which way. It's not really that complicated. What's going on is, say they just had this basic structure there, and they needed to triangulate it, so they had a tube in tension resisting a force. So they wanted to do that, but they couldn't because there was something in the way. So they can't connect here, so it's like, okay, well, what if I took it there and then I did that, which now you've changed it into two tubes, and this isn't great, but this is going to be better than nothing at all. And maybe it wasn't even that simple. They couldn't get down to this corner, so it came to here, and it came out there and came like that, and that's how you get this kind of crazy thing. And it's all kind of cause and effect. You have points that you need to connect, and there's either stuff in the way, or the opposite happens. You need, for instance, the engine mounts, the motor mounts need to be somewhere, and that space happens to be somewhere that's not supported well. So then you end up with multiple tubes coming from multiple directions trying to make that attaching point as stiff as possible, because that's the heaviest part of the car. That's the heaviest single thing that's having forces affecting it. Really what we're talking about here is load paths. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it's just where the forces are coming and going. And to give just a basic example, the structure of your car is being held up, one, by the tires, really, but at the chassis level, the top of the spring perches, the spring shock perch, all of the gravitational force of the car is going through those points. So a common thing you'll see is the top of the spring perch on a race car having some kind of straight line, some tube or something that goes straight from the top of that perch to the motor mount, if it's a mid-engine design. And, well, if the engine's in the rear, if it's in the front, it happened in the front. I'm trying to think if it's the D-type jag or the E-type jag. If you look at, there's a metal subframe, and if you look at where the front suspension is, it's so that it carries the weight of the engine without it having to have a bunch of metal to support it that it would have to make stiff. So that's multi-tube, that's the space frame. And if you're looking at making your own chassis and you're thinking, oh, this is too complicated, I'm just going to give you some structure examples of things I've seen on race cars. So it's not like you can't do this. But say this is the side of the car and you need to keep this from twisting because these are just small tubes, and is a big space. This might be 4 feet, 5 feet. This is probably where the driver sits. A common thing I've seen is just like you're making scaffolding, they'll divide this up a couple times and add triangulation, and it looks like that. And that makes a plenty stiff structure. Usually car designers want to be a little clever, a little more clever than that. So, if they can get away with one long tube, they do that. It depends on just how long this is and what the angle is. As much as if there's anything else that needs to, like, if there's something that needs to connect right there, well, okay, then they're going to need another thing there. And it might make sense to come all the way up. And then if it's going to do that, then it might make sense to have the things like that. Obviously, it's getting more complicated. The other thing is you should think three-dimensionally. I'm talking about this being the side of the car, and we're really just talking about up and down loads here. But you've got side-to-side things too. So rather than just having a triangulation through this kind of two-dimensional plane, it might go somewhere else so that it's also triangulating on side-to-side and twisting motions as much as up and down. Okay, so where do we go from there? The next evolution, and this happened around the same time that aluminum monocoques was coming out, and because it was a middle ground, is instead of having all these triangulations, you just rivet, or weld if you're using steel, but you just rivet an aluminum sheet across here, and suddenly that sheet that, you've got, say we had this rectangle and this riveted to it, now you've got triangulation in every direction, rather than just having one tube through. It's not going to help in compression at all because it's just sheet, but in tension, it's fantastic. It'll be light because it's aluminum, and it'll actually be stiffer than if it was just a tube. But that brings us to the monocoque, or what I'm going to call aluminum tub, because kind of like the space frame, monocoque's not really the correct term for what you usually see in a race car. Monocoque is better when you're talking about airplanes where the actual outside skin of the whole plane is the fuselage, is the chassis itself. In cars, a lot of times when you have a monocoque, part of it is the outside skin, but really it's the structure that kind of mimics a multi-tube frame, but it's made out of sheet metal rather than tubes. So the story I love about how monocoques came in modern times now, this is something has been introduced in race cars in numerous times in history, but the time where it really took off was with the Lotus 25 in Formula One. And the story goes that the problem they were trying to solve is the car had aluminum, any of the Formula One cars at the time had aluminum fuel tanks on the side of a steel multi-tube chassis. And you had to mount those gas tanks with some kind of flexible mount because the steel tube frame would flex more than the gas tanks would. And the problem they were trying to solve at Lotus was they kept getting cracked or split fuel tanks because the chassis was flexing more than the fuel tank. And somebody realized, well, wait a second, if the chassis is flexing more than the fuel tank, why don't we make the car out of the fuel tanks? And so what they did is they made a car that's basically two heftily made fuel tanks running from the front to the rear. Well, really the fuel tank's ending here, but the idea that it's just these two giant, it's almost like it's just two giant tubes. They're oval shaped, but they're tubes that are the sides of the car. And there's some bulkheads that connect the two. And I'll recycle the drawing I used in, I think, the suspension video, which is comically crude. This is simplified if you were just looking from the top of the car. The front rear suspension, here's engine, steering wheel, this is where the driver sits. What you've created is just these two sponsons, these two fuel tank areas, and you've got a bulkhead here that's going to have your spring perches on it and the lateral links for your rear suspension. You'll have a bulkhead that's your firewall, that's also the back of the seat for the driver, separating the driver from the engine, and that'll have the trailing arms go to it, and so that's keeping a stiff connection between those. And in simplest terms, you'd have one at the front. The radiator would sit out here, and you'd have a nose cone. And it doesn't always work out. It usually doesn't work out quite this easily. But you're going to have a bulkhead somewhere around here, and you'll mount gauges in the steering wheel the steering column will go to that. But that can also, it's holding these two sides, which means it's a great place to have the other part of the front suspension mount to. So why do we progress to this point where there's no longer tubes? Everything is just made out of the sheet metal. Well, remember I talked about the tube example where the wider out, the more spread out that material is, the stiffer it is. That's kind of what you're doing with the monocoque. Is the furthest point out on the car you can have is the outer edge of the skin of the car. So if you can have that be the structure, that's giving you the most leverage, the best vantage point for the material. Generally speaking, pound for pound, an aluminum monocoque is going to be stiffer than a steel space frame. I'm hoping this helps kind of demystify what it is you see when you see a chassis. If you're talking like Formula One cars or Formula Ford, Formula Junior, stuff like that from the era, and sports cars, if you really start looking at it, starting from where the suspension attaches to where all the loads are going, it's not super complicated. The simpler, kind of the better. It's the easier and cheaper it is to manufacture or fabricate, the lighter it'll be. The Lotus motto of simplify and add lightness. I hope this helps. To expand on this, we're going to take the things that I've discussed here and then through that lens look at the 38 chassis that I designed, that I developed looking at pictures, trying to figure out what it was they did, and I've modified that to how I would build it today, because there were a lot of things I just didn't understand when I was doing it. You can look at my video I have out on the GT40 chassis, but then we're going to look at a new chassis that I designed in the past couple weeks, where that I'm trying to take this now to the next level. But we'll use this to discuss, what things did I do were dumb and what things do I think are good ideas. And I'm hoping that helps make this all clear, because I realize me sitting here talking about it isn't necessarily the best way to explain this. Something else I hope to do later this year too is next time I go to like the Monterey Motorsport Reunion or something, I'm going to take video of different cars with their bodies off, looking at their chassis and the suspension, and we'll talk through it and see why it is the way things were designed the way they were. But anyways, I hope this is really just a primer. I'm not expecting you to go out and start welding based on this little ramble I just had, but I think we can use the information I've presented to kind of be on the same page as we discuss other chassis designs and get more into the nitty-gritty of why things are where they are, and what I'm trying to do and what other designers are trying to do. So I hope this helps, and I will see you shortly for the next one.